Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and what follows is a moderated conversation between Mike Vickers and Stephen Slick about Mike's book, By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy, which I have sitting on my virtual shelf in my Kindle, and I have been told by multiple people is excellent. And what follows is an excellent conversation about the book. Enjoy.
So we're very fortunate today, and actually throughout the week, to host Dr. Mike Vickers. Mike retired from public service, but not public life, in 2015, after serving as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. In that capacity, Mike was the senior civilian exercising, and this is a term of art, authority, direction, and control over the Defense Department's so-called combat support agencies, including the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Before serving as USDI, Mike was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. Mike's rich, varied, and impactful public service career began with his enlistment as a non-commissioned officer in the Army's Special Forces. He had been commissioned as a Special Forces officer by the time he eventually applied for the career training program at CIA. But before his operational training was even completed there, Mike had been dispatched by the agency on critical assignments to the Caribbean and to Lebanon. After his training, Mike was assigned to the predecessor of the Special Activities Division, where he thrived as the program manager and chief strategist for the Reagan administration's covert program to expel the Soviet army from Afghanistan. Mike stepped away from government to complete graduate school and co-founded an influential think tank in Washington, D.C., until finally President Bush persuaded Mike to return to government as part of the leadership team at the Pentagon. So my introduction doesn't do justice to the incredible range of Mike's career and accomplishments. I encourage you to buy at your favorite book stand and read this wonderful and engaging memoir. Indeed, I was going to say we had a stack of them, but the stack is gone. We can order another stack for you. You may be able to get Mike to sign your book if you promise him that you'll read it from cover to cover. Before I turn the floor over to Mike for a few framing remarks, I neglected to mention that Mike is no stranger to the 40 acres. He knows his way around. He's the proud parent of a recent Longhorn. So with all that, let's welcome Dr. Mike Vickers.
Thank you, Steve, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Steve asked me just to say a few words to frame the discussion, and then he'll ask me some questions, and then hopefully we'll leave plenty of time for you questions and comments about the writing and vetting process, why I wrote the book, and then illustrate some of the key principles with a few vignettes, and then I want to talk about the back end of the book, where I look forward a bit. So if you spend your life keeping the nation's secrets, it's not easy to write a book like that. And it kind of goes without saying, whatever writing challenges you have. And, number of us took an oath to keep those secrets until we go to the grave, and there are many that I will. The reason I wrote the book is three principal reasons. One, my former boss, Bob Gates, and one of my mentors and a few others said, given the experiences I had, and then at the sub-cabinet level, I had a duty to history to try to write an unclassified history of some of these events. The second reason was, since most of this world is really secret, where as senior leaders we can share some of it with the American people. That's important in democracy too. But the principal reason that really motivated me as my time in government service was coming to an end was really to try to help the next generation, to pass on what I'd learned, what worked, what didn't work, what we can take forward, because it's a dangerous world. And if we're handing the keys over to the next generation, we want them to do even better than we did. And so, that was really the motivation. And fortunately, CIA and the Department of Defense and the White House were very good about clearing the book. It took 10 months because of COVID, mainly because of the size of the Department of Defense and everybody else to look at it. But eventually got done. And one of the things I tried to do in writing the book was, at least for the version I sent to the government for clearance, was to document everything that had been cleared in other memoirs or declassified intelligence reports to make it a little easier for them. So let me now turn to some of the key principles or themes I'd like you to pick out of the book and illustrate them with some vignettes. So there were three big operations that I had the great fortune to participate in my lifetime. Lots of others, but three really stand out. As Steve mentioned, one of them as a CIA officer was the Covert Action Program, the largest in CIA's history. Many argue it's the most successful, that ended up expelling the Soviets out of Afghanistan. The second was our multiple campaigns against Al-Qaeda to deny them any sanctuary and to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat the group, particularly between 2007 and 2015. And then the third was the raid that brought justice to Osama bin Laden. And so two of those, I did as a policymaker, and one of them as an operator, and lots of other things are there. So a couple of themes I'd really like to emphasize. One of them is, if you look back from the late Cold War, where we started doing really well against the Soviets, the last decade in particular, but decade and a half. And then through our war with Al-Qaeda and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan the past couple of decades, America is usually on the strategic defensive, but offensive defensive strategies work far better. I have lessons in the book on strategy, intelligence, and special operations. I'm just going to hit some of the strategy ones here. But offensive, defensive strategies work better. And so, from my experience, the Reagan doctrine, supporting anti-communist forces in Afghanistan's case very aggressively in the Cold War, but also things like putting Pershing II missiles in Europe that countered the Soviet SS-20 intermediate range nuclear ballistic missile that led to a historic arms treaty with the Soviets, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, and others, and then using our attack submarines to hold Soviet boomers at risk. All that added up to give us a pretty successful grand strategy. On the Al-Qaeda front, there was the same thing. Once President Bush made the decision to go to an intensive drone campaign, or as we say, Predator, the name of the aircraft, armed reconnaissance and precision strike, that really broke Al-Qaeda's back, first in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, and then more recently in Yemen and other theaters. And then even with the bin Laden raid, another theme that I emphasize in the book is escalation dominance. And so what is escalation dominance? Well, if you think about World War II, why we won World War II? Well, lots of reasons. We learned, we did other things. But once the American economy was put on a war footing, we could outproduce our adversaries dramatically. And famous Japanese Admiral Yamamoto said, we will run wild for 6 months, but then we've woken up a sleeping giant, and then we're going to be in trouble. And that proved prophetic. Escalation dominance applies to the nuclear realm, but also to conventional operations and even counterterrorism operations. So to illustrate, with the Soviets in 1985, when I was fortunate to get the job as the Afghanistan Covert Action Program officer, our budget had just gotten quadrupled by a famous Texan, Charlie Wilson, in Congress. CIA had asked for a 10% budget increase, and it got a 300% budget increase. Trust me, you don't see that every day. And so we began to escalate our efforts in Afghanistan, and President Reagan changed our goal in March 1985 with a then top secret national security decision directive to drive the Soviets out rather than just impose costs on them. And then we sought to escalate further and convince Congress to double our budget again. The Soviets escalated at the same time. Like a lot of leaders frustrated with wars that are stalemates, Mikhail Gorbachev added 26,000 forces in 1985 to the 100,000 that were already there in Afghanistan. and gave his generals a year or two to win the war. At the end of that year, our escalation had beaten theirs, and they started looking for the withdrawal. Same thing was true on the drone campaigns between 2004 and 2008. We did about 35 strikes against Al Qaeda. We did that many in 4 months in 2008, and it continued after that. And that intensity really pinned Al Qaeda down and hurt them. And even something like the Bin Laden raid. We thought there were 4 armed men, including Bin Laden, in that compound among the 23 men, women, and children that were there. We sent in 24 SEALs to do the job. We had a reaction force of double that number 5 minutes away. We had fighter aircraft on alert in case the Pakistanis scrambled fighters. And so, tried to anticipate every contingency, but make sure we could dominate the local situation and accomplish the mission. And then the third thing, I guess I'd like to emphasize from the book, is that battles are won or lost, or wars are won or lost. As Clausewitz famously said, war is an extension of secret wars or open wars, or an extension of politics by other means. And that's true, they said, for secret wars as well. They're won or lost often in the capitals based on policy choices, and if not ours, sometimes in the capitals of your allies. And so, America doesn't go to war without allies, including our secret war community. And coalition warfare is quite challenging politically. So let me wrap up and offer a few thoughts on a little unusual for a memoir. I have a chapter at the end called Winning the New Cold War. And it's a prescription about how we can compete over the long term and prevail over China and Russia, if they stay aligned. And there's 5 things I talk about: restoring our national unity and resilience. Has a lot of dimensions to it, economic and others. What I think is the central competition between us and the Chinese over the long haul, the economic and technological competition. In the 20th century, we never had an adversary who had more than 50% of our GDP. China's stumbling right now, but they're at 60% or so. And if they get their act together, they may surpass us next decade. And so that economic escalation dominance that we had in the 20th century, we won't necessarily have in the 21st. And then there's AI and quantum computing and synthetic biology and a lot of other things that are remaking the world. And that's a central part of that. And then related to that is the competition for global influence, particularly information influence, and what I describe as winning the intelligence wars across the board. That contributed a lot to how we kept the Cold War cold, and then how we ultimately won it. And then I have a section on strengthening our regional and global deterrence, including ideas on transforming intelligence and defense, and then finally our national security institutions and allies. Now, it paints a challenging period ahead of us for the next couple of decades, including our challenges at home. It's been said that when intelligence officers tend to tilt a little bit toward the realist side, not using international relations clearly, but just trying to see the world the way it is. And as a consequence, on the optimistic, pessimistic scale, a little more toward the pessimistic view of things, because we look for threats. And it's been said, when an intelligence officer sees flowers, he or she immediately looks around for the coffin. So I may be a little guilty of that as well, but you'll have to judge for yourself. So with that, I've kind of hit the highlights of the book. There's a lot more in it, but you probably have a lot of questions on current events, and so we can take this wherever you'd like. Steve.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That's terrific. Well, I promised you one softball.
Okay.
But you already swung at that. That's why I write a memoir. It's not unprecedented in the security, intelligence, and military communities, but it's also not the norm. So I appreciate your explanation, and this is the target audience then, based on your explanation. So I'll go to a second one. This one's going to be over the plate, but it's not so soft. Career management. So we've got a lot of folks in the audience here who are interested in pursuing a career like yours, preparing for public service, maybe in foreign affairs or national security. And I was curious in looking through your book, what lessons there were, because you did a number of things in and out of government for a number of different agencies. It doesn't appear to be much of a pattern there, right? And so I'm going to ask you to sort of organize that. I particularly appreciated and enjoyed your explanation for why you were drawn to guerrilla warfare. You said because you liked freeing people from tyranny. That's what I thought I would like. that's a lot to digest. But you made a lot of career choices, big career choices, lurching career choices. And then within that, a lot of specific assignments. This assignment, not that assignment. And I don't think it was random. So what were the guideposts? What was steering you through this adventurous career you had?
So I actually had a high school teacher my senior year when we were in the school library researching term papers. And he put a copy of that day's New York Times on the desk in front of me and opened it up to a story about CIA's paramilitary operations in Laos as part of the Vietnam War, biggest one at the time, and said, you might be interested in this. And I thought, I don't know why he thought that. And I'm dreaming about throwing touchdown passes or hitting baseballs, not softballs, but turns out I was. And so as I realized my passion for baseball and football wasn't matched by my abilities in baseball. I started thinking, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, I'd like to be James Bond. And so so my path was to become a Green Beret, and I had studied some Russian in college at that point, and then acquire some more experience, and then go into the CIA. And that part, up until and I had this weird view when I was 19 that I couldn't wait. I wanted to just skip over my 20s with a lot of training. I couldn't wait to be in my 30s because that's what James Bond was. And I figured I'd be fully trained, and I had a 10-year plan. And it more or less worked out. I mean, careers are as much by design as anything else. But then after that, or luck as well as design. After that, I had no idea. I came into CIA with Russian, Czech, and Spanish. And so I thought I was like you, go to serve in the Soviet bloc at the beginning. And first thing happened, I got sent for the invasion of Grenada. And then Lebanon, the response to the Beirut bombings of our embassy and then Marine barracks, and then finally the Afghan program. And so, I ended up spending a lot of my time in the Middle East and have been doing it since. So that part's, not so much by design, but it's always good for, I think, a special operator or a intelligence officers to go where the action is, or as we say, run to the sound of the guns. And so I tried to make that a bit of a mantra. And then later in my career, after I developed expertise in those areas, covert ops, clandestine operations, and special operations intelligence, I broadened during my graduate study years and think tank years to nuclear strategy and space and future warfare. And that helped when I became a senior official in the Pentagon. But mentors were critically important. They gave me a lot of jobs. I didn't necessarily pick them.
Would you, and feel free to identify them, would you describe your relationship to mentors? What did they mean to you, and at what points in your career, and who gets credit for helping put you where you ended up?
Yeah, so early on, I was the junior member of Special Forces teams tasked to go into Eastern Europe in the event of war.
With something on your back.
With a backpack nuclear weapon. But, 23, it seemed like a good idea. Doesn't seem so good anymore. But all my teammates were Vietnam veterans. Some had done incredibly dangerous missions. Others were Eastern European emigres who were beneficiaries of the Lodge Act and knew their homelands and wanted to liberate their homelands. And so I got a really great education early on, along with a lot of formal schooling in the military. And then, got selected for early command by a Special Forces colonel of a counterterrorism unit. And then CIA, same thing. An officer picked me out of training and sent me to Grenada. Bill Rooney.
Bill Rooney passed away.
Rest in peace. And then rest in peace. And then a couple of others picked me for the Afghan program. And, I wouldn't have accomplished anything without them, So, and then later in life, Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, gave me a lot of responsibility as an assistant undersecretary of defense of Leon Panetta continued it. So, mentors teach you things, but they also empower you and enable you, and have your confidence in you and let you do things. And, and that's been what I attribute whatever success I've had.
And the local addendum, Bob Gates would identify Bob Inman as a key mentor in his career.
Indeed.
So there's a continuum.
Indeed.
Okay, you also mentioned something else I was going to raise with you, and that's the Afghan Covert Action Program. You describe it in the book as a decisive battle in the Cold War. And you talked a little bit about the change in policy about the time you arrived, the Reagan administration shifting its aim in the covert action from simply bleeding and inflicting pain, inflicting costs on the Soviet army for the occupation to actually expelling them, sending them home back across the Freedom Bridge, right? And eventually came to pass. You also described the resources, right? All of a sudden there's money available that wasn't available before. Would you just complete the story from there? And because your account of all this is historically significant because of your role, there's still misunderstandings around this. So pick it up with the Stinger anti-aircraft missile. What should people understand about that? And then also trace us from the Soviet withdrawal in 1989 to the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later. It's an extraordinary claim that this decisive battle, decisive defeat led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think I share your assessment of it, but I'd like to hear it.
Sure. So, the first thing I think is that one, it was serendipitous that Congressman Wilson took this interest and dumped this and got away with it. And something you probably couldn't do today to, dump hundreds of millions of dollars on an agency. But then, as is often the case, opportunity grows out of crisis. And so there were criticisms. The war was 5 years on and it was a stalemate, and no analyst believed that the insurgents could win. Red Army had never been defeated. And the assessment of Gorbachev when he came to power is that he wouldn't do anything too risky because he needed to shore up his domestic base. So, it didn't look too favorable. And we were being criticized on the right, which has echoes of Ukraine today, that the program was riddled with corruption, and the Pakistanis, our frontline state, were keeping all the weapons for themselves and they weren't getting in. And then those on the left were saying, this is hopeless, you're fighting to the last Afghan. And so that triggered a National Security Council review. And I helped write the outcome that ended up in this presidential directive with a partner on the NSC. But it reviewed all our objectives and, should we stay the course? Should we do this? And one of them was drive the Soviets out by all means available. And I looked at that, I thought, well, that's the one I want to do. We got all these resources. And fortunately, CIA management agreed with me. And that's where the title for the book comes. And then we had to persuade all our allies. Chinese, they were our biggest arms supplier. It's a very different world then than it is today. Pakistan, the frontline state, Saudi Arabia, which matched our funding dollar for dollar to escalate with us. And that took some months. And then to start introducing more sophisticated weapons. So at first, I wanted to get a British surface-to-air missile called the blowpipe because we couldn't put U.S. weapons in. And at first, the British government said no, and then we kept at it. And 6 months later, Margaret Thatcher approved it. So we put that in. So to your question about the Stinger, President Reagan made the decision to, after the Pakistanis really wouldn't accept U.S. weapons for the first 6 years of the conflict. And then President Zia, president of Pakistan at the time, had a change of heart and said, I think it's time to introduce the Stinger. So we said, sure, why not? And President Reagan approved it in January 86, formally signed in March 86, and it was introduced in September 86. it had a remarkable record. It shot down 75, had a 75% kill rate. But the Soviets had essentially decided to withdraw by that point. So it more kept them heading toward the exit than was the decisive war winner. The biggest year in terms of casualties and everything was really this knockdown drag out in 1985. And then the rest was kind of continuing to push them out. Their first withdrawals occurred before the Stinger was put in, and then they really picked up steam. And after the Soviets relaxed their war aims, from trying to keep a communist Afghan government to just saying, we want out, whatever government ends up there. And that's what led to the last soldier, General Gromov, crossing the Freedom Bridge. So then to your question about the aftermath, once the Soviets withdrew, the same year, the Berlin Wall fell, Eastern Europe was liberated.
You're welcome.
Yes. Very good. The Afghan program was important in defeating the Soviets, but so was the system of solidarity, so it's and then, being honest, Mikhail Gorbachev was a leader that had other objectives, and these were obstacles to revitalizing the Soviet economy and liberalizing in certain ways. A different leader probably would have stayed longer, suffered longer, but so that made a difference too. But I think it did play a role in ending the Cold War. And then, the tragic part of it is that in 1990, we were forced by a congressional amendment to cut off all aid to Pakistan because President Bush couldn't certify that Pakistan wasn't on it crossed the line over toward nuclear weapons. And we disengaged from the region. And Afghanistan descended into the hell. Taliban came to power. Al-Qaeda invited in, and the rest is history. The reason there's not a straight line between the Afghan in the 80s and the horrible attacks of 9/11 is that there were a lot of policy. There's 12 years, and there were a lot of policy choices as you look at this sanctuary gathering in Afghanistan that you can take action against, and we did. And so the way we did counterterrorism after 9/11. In retrospect, we should have done before, but that wasn't our policy at the time.
Thanks for that, Mike. The only thing I'd add, I think it was in what you're describing, was that another impact of the military defeat in Afghanistan was that the people of the Soviet Union discovered the government was lying to them.
Yes.
As the body bags came.
That's right.
They were claiming they weren't suffering losses in Afghanistan. No, they were suffering grave losses. And the people in the towns and villages of the Soviet Union knew that because their kids weren't coming home. Yeah. Right. That broken trust from the Chernobyl disaster, when they allowed the people to celebrate May Day in the streets rather than warning them to go inside and protect themselves against this radioactive material coming out of the air.
Yeah. And to give you a sense of that, the official, and they're doing the same thing in Ukraine today, lying about the casualties are suffering. The official Soviet estimate of losses in Afghanistan was 13,000 something or other. It was actually double, and it was over 26,000. And in the brief opening after the Cold War, the Russian general staff wrote a history of it and disclosed that. But so that, and then Chernobyl, and then lack of confidence in being told the truth, and others. And ironically, a lot of Ukrainian mothers, they were bearing a bigger brunt of it than some other parts of the Soviet Union.
So staying on not the Soviet Union but Russia, turning to Russia, Ukraine. I know even in your household you have interest in following this quite closely, and I know you have views because you've shared some of them with me. If I could ask you just to assess the strategies of the two belligerents, disposition of forces, what has happened in 18 months or so, and what you expect to happen, and if you would use two of the terms that are prevalent in your book. The one being a war-winning strategy. Does either side have a war-winning strategy? And secondly, escalation dominance. Is either side approaching escalation dominance?
So Putin thought he could win quickly, and Russia had been on a roll. We had largely ignored them for a lot of the post-Cold War period, and they first succeeded in a limited operation in Georgia in 2008, and in Ukraine, annexing Crimea and stirring up trouble in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine in 2014. We didn't respond much to that, didn't provide any lethal assistance to the Ukrainians. 2015, they intervened in Syria. And again, we're kind of heading toward the exits then. And so the Russians perceive they have a victory. 2016, they intervene in our presidential election on a bigger scale than they've ever done before. And then 2021, they see our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then Putin gives his crazy Ukraine's not a real country speech again in July 21. And then we follow it up with statements. We're not going to commit any forces or do anything. And so he thought he had a green light, and he thought it would be easier than it was. The Russian army turned out to be much worse. Ukrainians turned out to be much better. But it settled down into static warfare in the East. And, one of the challenges is the Ukrainians, they didn't have a real choice in the matter based on how they were equipped. But the Russians essentially had 9 months to dig in and create the defensive belts. And, U.S. policy has been to gradually equip them, first saying we're not going to do something, then we do it. But still, they don't have the tanks that they were promised. They don't have all the engineering equipment to clear minefields. They don't have fighters. They don't have enough artillery or rocket artillery to hit deep. America, we know how to fight the Russians from our Soviet Cold War days and these defensive belts. We wouldn't fight the way we're asking the Ukrainians to fight right now, without air superiority, without artillery and or sufficient artillery and others. And so they're fighting. It looks like World War I because that's what you do when you don't have the other stuff, and you're trying to make modest gains and clear minefields laying on your stomach. And so neither side has escalation dominance right now. Putin thinks he can outlast the West. That's his strategy. His strategy is essentially we'll get tired and leave, and the politics of the West will work for him at some point. He's hoping our 2024 election turns out a certain way. He's been back in the same horse several elections now, and one time he won, one time he didn't win, but he's hopeful for 2024. And if the Ukrainians have a more successful counter offensive next year, then, and if the elections don't go the way he wants, or the West doesn't wobble as much as he hopes it will, then he may reconsider his position in 2025, but not before. And, and then on the Ukrainian side, they may gain a lot of their territory. The question is whether they can gain it all and how fast. And that depends on us as much as them. But it's a daunting problem, for a smaller country to, they're suffering a lot of casualties too, to sustain this fight, this high intensity fight over a longer period of time. So I think our aim ought to be to try to do what we can to bring this war to a conclusion as soon as possible, to get on with the rebuilding. But also, long wars just hurt. They undermine democracies, but they also, inflict a lot more human suffering and casualties. And if you're stuck with it, you're stuck with it. But if you have a choice, you should try to make it more decisive soon.
A threshold question I always like to pose on complicated situations like this is, on whose side is time here?
Yeah, Russians certainly think it's on theirs, and just like the Taliban did, the Taliban
proved to be
right, although it was self-inflicted wound on our part. But
that's next.
The Taliban said, you have the watches, we have the time. And Russians think the same thing. But in the long run, if Ukraine is more integrated into the West in the security architecture and the economic architecture, it'll be tough to do a repeat for this.
Okay, thanks. You hit the next issue, and that's Afghanistan and future threats from terrorist organizations. And so the Hamas attacks obviously remind us that our enemies are still out there, and they're lethal and they're dangerous. You described in the book the withdrawal from Afghanistan as a strategic blunder. You wrote Al-Qaeda will be back, and that President Trump and President Biden turned a stalemate that protected U.S. interests into a defeat that placed our interests in jeopardy.
Yeah, it's harsh language, but I think it's accurate in the sense that the Taliban never could have won had we not decided to leave and stop supporting the Afghan government, air power and advisors, and that caused them to collapse. And I think that's, it was a rolling collapse. It isn't something that happened all at once. It happened in the provinces. And, I think we are worse off in a sense that Al-Qaeda is down right now. ISIS-K, the branch of ISIS that's in Afghanistan is reasonably down. But when you give these groups time to reconstitute, they take times on their side, and they do. We've seen that over and over again the past 20 years, where they had their sanctuary in Afghanistan, they lost it, they went to Pakistan cities, they got captured, they went to the frontier region, and the threat to America went up. We started striking them, the threat went down, they moved to Syria with the civil war, and the threat went up from there. They built up operations in Yemen, and the threat went up from there. And, it's just a very, very familiar pattern. So it doesn't take much. It takes intelligence. It takes overwatch with the predators, and doing it from a distance imposes costs on you. It takes relationships with foreign government. We're much better off in Afghanistan having a government on our side than a hostile government. So that's my main point.
You wrote in
and Ryan Rocker, a lot of the Afghan hands, I think share my assessment.
Yeah, that's not a minority view.
Not a minority view. Unpopular and not a pleasant one. But,
so on that point, just to clarify, you'd written a couple chapters before this that in 2010, in your view, that the United States had gained escalation dominance over Al-Qaeda, minimized the threat largely. And so your message is that in the succeeding years we've surrendered that near victory or suppressed threat, and that now it's rising again, or that escalation dominance has been lost. Or how do I understand that?
Yeah, it's been eroded. I mean, we continue to have success through the decade. So the reason I say 2010 is after these barrage of strikes between 2008 and 2010, Al-Qaeda's top leadership made the decision to go to ground, to stop plotting and just try to wait us out. And we continued to trick them over time, and then had the war with ISIS, and Zawahiri was just killed last year, and some very dangerous people were taken off the battlefield in Yemen. So it really spanned the decade. But now our position is being eroded a bit. It's not collapsing, all of a sudden in the region, but it is being eroded. And, we have fewer governments to work with. We have to fly longer distances. We won't have the intelligence on the ground that we had when we were there. So, over time, the effects accumulate. That's more the point. And it would be easier to maintain, that stronger position at low cost had we not completely withdrawn.
So last question on that general topic. You were, of course, the senior civilian responsible for directing and overseeing the uniformed special forces. And I've noticed recently that the Army in particular is looking at, it's being discussed that they may reduce the special operations forces by 10%. This has been interpreted as being part of this shift in national security focus from the Middle East, countering terrorism, to East Asia and peer competitors, China, to put a name to it. What do you think is the role for the U.S. Special Forces after this tremendously robust and active mission they've been at for 20 years after the 9/11 attacks, and now with America having new military and intelligence priorities to concern itself with? How do we maintain the current levels of the Special Forces? Does the mission change? Does their staffing, training, and preparation differ in some way?
Yeah, so between 2001 and 2010, 10-ish, 2011, the manpower in Special Operations Forces doubled. We did a really big buildup for all those wars, and the budget tripled and the deployments quadrupled. Even with our growth, we were using them more than we had planned. And so it's twice the size it was 20 years ago. And so, you might be able to trim here and there. The Army's, under a lot of budget pressure right now, deferring modernization and other things. But Special Operations Forces, they have to maintain the counterterrorism mission and other missions, counter-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, if you have a loose nuke or things like that. But they're also important in engagement around the world, in the global competition for the white soft aspect, yes. And then, that'll be important with our strategic competition. And then for frontline states, the Baltics or Taiwan, they're important for, as we did in the Cold War, to build up stay behind networks, if big adversary invades, to make it much tougher for them to buy time for the United States. And then, if you're going to do some special reconnaissance or to enable the Air Force and Navy to strike better, they're the likely folks to get the job, particularly our Navy SEALs in a maritime environment like China, Taiwan. So there's still a lot of roles and traditional roles. And, they're 1% of the defense budget.
So you don't see that as an area where savings can be accrued, that can then be applied to other systems we may need.
Yeah, so
for the conventional war.
Yeah, 3 years ago in the, kind of strategic monism about China. And I mean, I've been working on the China issue for 30 years. It's important, but, we took 700 special operators out of Africa, the whole continent. And I mean, what are you saving there? You're going to go buy some coffee, or you're not going to buy many airplanes or submarines, but they savings, So it's a little penny wise and pound foolish.
Okay, that's terrific.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.